bring up the most important man in San Luis Obispo County, the guy who has to defeat Bruce Gibson.
Thank you for coming tonight, or today, I guess. Your generosity is wonderful. Clearly, I will beat Gibson. And and your help.
You're gonna have to speak up. That keeps going out.
I gotta yell.
Okay, your help greatly helps me to do just that, and we will succeed. Not too much about me today because you came here to hear someone else, and I understand that. I'm going to turn things back over to Barry Fisher, our campaign director of operations.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Okay, well, we all know the biblical story of David and Goliath. But according to the New World Encyclopedia, in the modern world, Goliath has become the symbol of institutionalized power. I think that description pretty much fits Bruce Gibson. Our David is Dr. Bruce Jones. He's a citizen with intelligence and compassion and will stand against the gluttonous nature of government. Okay? Your support here today and in the run-up to November 8th, general election, is critical, and we'll probably be asking you for more support as we move forward over the next 30 days or so. With that in mind, I'd like to introduce Dr. Victor Davis Hanson. He's a distinguished fellow at the Center for American Greatness and a senior fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution. He's an American military historian, columnist, a former classics professor and scholar of ancient warfare. He has also been a visiting professor at Hillsdale College since 2004. Victor was awarded the National Humanities Medal in 2007 by President George W. Bush. He's also a farmer growing raisin grapes on his family farm in Selma, California, and a critic of social trends related to farming and agrarianism. He's a prolific columnist, writer. I can't imagine how many times I see you headlining an article every 3 or 4 times a week at least. And I just have one question. When do you have time to take out the trash? Okay. He's also the author of recent books, The Second World Wars, How the First Global Conflict Was Fought and Won, and The Case for Trump, and his newly released book, The Dying Citizen. So, ladies and gentlemen, please help me in welcoming Dr. Victor Davis.
Thank you very much, and I'm very happy to be here. I want to thank Scott Raven and his wife for arranging this for me. And all I can say about the local race is that the left is crazy, and they're trying to convince you the same that you're crazy. And you can't ever forget that, because here we are, just a few weeks before the election, and all we hear is that there is not going to be a red wave. Republicans are going to lose. The momentum has crashed. Aviator Joe is now on a comeback. He's up to 42% approval. And all I would ask you is to remember those in my age group, what happened in 1994 when we had the Gingrich Contract with American Revolution. Just about after Labor Day, they, being the media and the left, said that there's no way that the Republicans can ever take back. The momentum was passed and they're going to lose. And that was a huge win of 56 seats in the House, state and local elections. In 2010, they said the Tea Party had lost momentum. There would be no midterm correction of the Obama administration. They lost over 63 seats. And after that point, remember, Obama had to rule by executive order. He had no constituency anymore. And during that period, they lost 1,000 state and local offices. It was the biggest Republican renaissance since the 1920s. And I think we're setting ourselves up for the same idea. Don't pay any attention to the media, the propaganda. there's going to be a huge correction because people feel that they woke up sometime in 2022 and they felt they were strangers in a strange land. They didn't recognize things. And how does that apply to the state of California? And I think our problem in California is we have the highest basket of income, sales, and gas taxes of any people in the United States. We have the highest electricity prices in the continental United States. We have the highest gas prices. And when we look to see what we get in return for it, our high school test scores are 45th in the nation. Forbes rated our infrastructure. We drove on the Highway 152 on the way over, and then on I-5, and then on 101, and I can tell you they haven't changed since I was in high school, when there were 16 million people versus 41. So we're rated 48th to 49th in infrastructure. We have 1/3 of all the welfare recipients in the United States live in California, 45% of all the homeless, 22% live below the poverty line. And so you ask yourself, how did this happen? What happened? We have to try to figure out what happened so we can fix it. And some of it was beyond our control. In the last 25 years, we've had this globalized elite on the East and West Coast, one looking at the EU, one looking at Asia. And there was a level of wealth that had never been imagined in finance, investment, insurance, law, media, academia, but especially high-tech Silicon Valley. $7 trillion of capitalization just between Berkeley and Stanford alone. And if you think, well, what does that mean? That means that a person like Mark Zuckerberg can infuse $420 million in the last election to absorb the work of about 50 precincts in key states and not even know that he spent the money. It's nothing to a person who's worth $60 billion. By the way, he lost $70 billion in the last 3 weeks. That's the good news, but the bad news is he doesn't even know that he lost it because he's worth $60 billion. And if you look at the Fortune 400, if we were to look at it 40 years ago, we would see the wealth in America, maybe the top 300 had $1 billion, but most of the wealth was in things like oil and gas and mining and agriculture and construction and manufacturing. If you look at it today, $4 billion barely gets you on the top 400, and almost all of the wealth, as I said, is in tech, social media, traditional media, insurance, law, academia, all of that. It's a radical change that the Democratic Party and the left is the party of the very wealthy and the subsidized poor. And the Republican Party is the party of the middle class. And that's what is encouraging, because the way to look at, I think, what's in California and the United States, they have Wall Street, they run K through 12. I can guarantee you they run the universities where our children are indoctrinated. They run Facebook and Google and Apple and censor the dissemination of media and information. They run the corporate boardroom. They run the NFL, the NBA, professional sports. They run Hollywood. They have every institution except one. They don't have 51% of the people. They do not have the people. And so we're in a kind of an existential fight, because we've never seen so much wealth used for political purposes. In California, the reason that we have this disjunct where we pay so much taxes and we pay such high costs for energy and electricity and insurance, and we get so little return, is because we are run, as I said, by people who brought in $7 trillion, and when you talk to them, and I unfortunately work in the middle of them, they don't feel that the state needs agriculture.
They don't care about cattle. They don't think we need construction because they say we've got $7 trillion. And if you try to say you can't eat Facebook, you can't drink Google, you can't build Apple, they don't care. They have so much money and power. And that is why the state has changed. There was a second thing that made the state change, and that is in the last 40 years, 4 to 5 million people have fled. And they were the professional and upper middle class entrepreneurial class. These were the people that were the bedrock support of Ronald Reagan, George Bush, Pete Wilson, and to a lesser extent, they started to fade during Arnold Schwarzenegger's rule, but they're not here anymore. At the same time, 40% of all the people who came illegally in the United States came to California. 27% of California's population, 27% of California's population was not born in the United States, which is not a problem, except we, the hosts, lost confidence in the powers of assimilation, integration, intermarriage, and we did not integrate that population. And that was the key to the Democratic takeover of the state. Big money in the Bay Area, a new constituency of poor immigrants, maybe most of them came in through illegal auspices, and the vanishing to Florida, Texas, Nevada, Wyoming of the old Reagan upper middle class. So, and so what would change that? Well, we're not going to change Mark Zuckerberg or Lisa Jobs or the people in Silicon Valley or the professors at Stanford, or the state is run by a zip code or maybe a 50-mile radius. If you look where Barbara Boxer came from, Dianne Feinstein, Gavin Newsom, Kamala Harris, Nancy Pelosi, they all live within 50 miles of each other. They all talked about diversity. They were the least diverse people in the world. They had the same incomes, they had the same attitudes. They came from the same zip code. But they're all now, with the exception of Kamala Harris, they're getting older, and people have now seen them in action for a long time. And what is very encouraging, where we live in the San Joaquin Valley, people like Karl Rove for years said, well, the Mexican-American population is innately conservative, and they're going to vote. They never voted Republican for more than 20%, 30%. And that was a lie that the Republican establishmentarians told us. I think now it's very different because we've had an upwardly mobile new creation of a middle class, and they are furious about abortion on demand, transgenderism put in the schools, critical race theory, the inability to walk in downtown Fresno or Bakersfield at night, the idea you pay $7 a gallon for diesel fuel, $188 for a 250-foot spool of Romex. And I think for the first time, they are starting to emulate the ideology of a middle class that used to be Reaganite. It's not there yet, but if the old middle class and the new middle class unite, I think we'll start to see some change. I think Lonnie Chen, to take Chen for example, he's running for state controller. He's a colleague of mine. He's not a populist. He's not used to being out, but my gosh, he's a brilliant guy. If he were state controller, we would start to learn very quickly how much the $30 billion that's lost in California, somebody took it. He would bring in a revolution, but more importantly, he would tell people that it's not set in stone that California not have one statewide Republican. Remember what happened. The left has a supermajority in the state Senate, the state Assembly. Out of 53 seats in the Congress, there's only 11. There's not one statewide Republican officer. And the Federal Court of Appeals is left-wing out of San Francisco. So this state was hijacked by an ideology for the reasons I outlined. And so for it to be retaken, we need to reconstitute a new middle class that tries to bring everybody's attention is the state, whether you're driving on 101 or the 99 by Delano, or your children are in the LA school district, or you're trying to fill up with gas, and you're sitting on the fifth richest state in the country as far as natural gas and oil, the third richest in timber, and you're not utilizing any of these resources. You're importing oil from Saudi Arabia, gas from Alaska. If people can articulate that, and I think it's going to be a bright future for California, because anything that cannot go on won't go on. And we cannot continue this and lose 500,000 people a year. Remember, I'm not going to speak ill of Texas, but naturally, if you go into Texas, it's hell, and California is paradise. We made paradise into hell, and they made hell into paradise. And that's why, and that doesn't have to, that's not set in stone, it's not a static idea. So I think that there's grounds for confidence. The problem we've had, as I said, that they control all of these institutions. Unfortunately, and I think this is underappreciated, all of those institutions that were hijacked are in California. Hollywood is in California. Many of the professional sports, the most important ones, are in California. The Times Educational Supplement rated the top universities, not in classics or English, but in science, physics, and 5 of the top 30, 5 of the top 10 are in California. Caltech, Stanford, Berkeley, UCLA, USC. So and then we had all of Silicon Valley. So if this revolution can go against all of those forces in entertainment and professional sports and tech, academia, and prevail, then I think the rest of the country will be encouraged. Because whatever happens in here will always sets the tone. I'd like to just then briefly touch on the national scene, what happened, and what we should look at in the midterms. We had this period between 2017 and 2021 where someone without any political experience, many of you voted against him in the primary, you didn't think Donald Trump had a chance. He was sort of the character that you remember, our generation, maybe you remember him in High Noon or Shane or The Searchers, that person who comes in and the community needs to get rid of the cattle barons or the banditos, Magnificent Seven, and he has a certain set of skill sets, and he's in the real world and he takes care of these problems, so we become the world's greatest producer of natural gas and oil within 4 years. We go down to 1.3% inflation right before COVID. We have 2.1% GDP growth. We start to rebuild the wall, and finally we have almost no illegal migration. And as things get better, people say, now that Shane came in, or now that John Wayne's got Natalie Wood back, or now that the Magnificent Seven's got, we really are appalled by his manner. He's crude, he's crass, and maybe it's time for him to ride off. And that was sort of the fate of the tragic hero that Donald Trump enlisted. And then I think what happened was a lot of people, thank you so much. A lot of people who shouldn't have thought that way felt, well, yes, he had a great 4 years, but I don't like him tweeting that Anthony Fauci throws a ball like a girl. That's just so or that Liz Cheney is ugly. That was beyond the pale. I can't, in my name, I can't be seen with him. If I go to a party and people ask me, I don't know how many people in my family say, you wrote a book about Donald Trump, we're just not going to ever talk to you. And they haven't. And so, at that point, everybody said, well, there was good old Joe Biden who's scrambling. And he's a uniter. And everybody, and we fight. All of us, you did to your friend. You said he was never a uniter. He was a plagiarist when he dropped out of the 1988 campaign. He lied about his resume. He was kicked out for a semester in law school for cheating. he had a history of racism. He said, put you all back in chains and he said that to a professional group of accomplished black professionals. Put you all back in chains. And then he said, that Barack Obama was the first articulate black that had ever run. Very condescending. He called a black podcast host a junkie. Another person, he said, you ain't black. He gave us those ridiculous corn pop stories about black youth touching his golden hairs. He had a history of bothering underage women by invading their space. That's a euphemism. He terrorized. So there, I could go on, but he was not what the media said he was. But anyway, he was sold. I don't want to get into the 2020 election. In my view, by the time the election took place, it was a little bit irrelevant because 102 million people voted, early voting, or by mail-in ballot. Once Donald Trump called me and said, I had a great second debate. I said, it didn't matter, Mr. President. 65 million people had already voted. And so what happened was in March and April, in the key states, the voting laws were changed against the will of the legislature through court injunction or bureaucratic fiat. And this is the key thing to remember about the election. On election day, only 30% of the electorate who cast ballots showed up on election day. The other 70% had either filed a mail-in ballot already or an early ballot. And this is a key statistic. Typically, in a presidential election, it's about a third of that number, and the error rate per state usually is about 3 to 6% of the ballots are cast. That are 3% are rejected for false names or name is not on the registrar list, incomplete names. This year, because of this election round, because of COVID, the error rate died statewide on an average to 0.3 by a magnitude of 10. So think of that. You're tripling the number of people who are not voting on election day, and you're decreasing the rejection rate by a magnitude of 10, and you can see what happens. And that was done in March and April. And I think this time people are aware of it. And I think there's last time we looked at the Bradley Foundation, 100 groups now on the conservative side are watchdog, well-funded groups that are looking at this. But nevertheless, we entered this era where suddenly almost everything that we knew, it was a totalitarian revolution, it was a cultural revolution, it was a 24/7, 360. People thought that if they could control the past and the present, they could control the future. So all of the reference that we knew, George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, statues, the names were changed, almost as if we were in the French Revolution. I came to work one day at the Hoover Tower, and I walked in, I thought something was strange. So I said to my assistant, I just walked on Father Sarah Boulevard. Remember the great 18th century missionary that helped introduce agriculture? He was a wonderful man. And he said, where have you been? There is no such thing as Father Sarah Boulevard. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, we just changed the name a month ago. And that's the experience that we all have, that all of these iconic figures, we in the present said, we're so much better than the pre-industrial past. They didn't have antibiotics, they didn't have glasses, they didn't have any of the advantages that we did. But we're going to judge them by the present and find them wanting. And all of the heritage they gave us, all of the institutions, the infrastructure, we're going to reject because they don't measure up to our particular standard of morality. And that was a revolutionary, and anybody who opposes this, we're going to ostracize, cancel, smear, slander. And what was the purpose of that? The purpose was to bring a woke culture throughout the United States in every aspect of our life, without 51% of the people supporting it, through our institutions, through television, through radio, through films, through professional sports, through your children in K through 12, through your kids in the first year when they come home from college. And what was that revolution? What does woke mean? Woke means that all inequality, everybody in this room is not equal. Let's take your income. But me, being a wokester, if I was the spokesman for the wokester, I have so much moral superiority over all of you. I'm so much better than you are that I can tell every one of you who has more than the other people, you did something wrong. Your advantages were not due to hard work, they were not due to accident, they were not due to better health, they were due to some culpable prejudice or bias that you exercised, or you inherited. And therefore, myself, being wiser than you, Joe Biden or Bill Gates or George Soros, whoever these people are, and a lot of them, I have the power and I deserve the power to even the playing field. So if a particular rubric gets into Stanford University as a freshman at 12%, say African Americans, I say they should be in at 16%. Because some kid on a forklift in Bakersfield whose parents never went to college, has no money, and is a straight A student, suffers from white privilege. That's what they do. And I can tell you that you should not be able to buy a car with gas in the next 15 years because I've decided that it's not good for you. That type of idea. But the key to all of this was none of these elite or anointed people were ever subject to the consequences of their own policies or ideologies. So what did that mean? This is the most frustrating, and this is their great weakness. That meant that John Kerry will lecture you and lecture you and lecture you about carbon emissions, and he will fly on a private jet because only he should be able to jet around to save you from carbon emissions. Or he will have 6 homes. Or Oprah will lecture you and she'll live in a Montecito estate. Or Mark Zuckerberg will say that there is no utility to walls on the border, and he has 3 walled estates. I couldn't buy them in Palo Alto and San Francisco. Or people in the Bay Area of this group will say that teachers' unions are vital for every public schools, and charter schools are an anathema, but I have to put my kid in Casalea or Sacred Heart or the Menlo School because I just couldn't sacrifice them on this great experiment that I'm conducting in the public school. Or we think that 30 cents per kilowatt hour is what everybody should pay for electricity because that will discourage generation of electricity by oil. But we live on the Bay Area that's about 65 degrees year round, so I don't have an air conditioner or heater in my office at Stanford. But around August 10th, I go into the Selma Walmart and it's full of people who are sitting there because it's free air conditioning. And they can't afford it, even with a subsidized rate that many have qualified, they can't afford it. So this group of people has injected or infused or forced upon us through these institutions that they control a revolutionary idea that they're going to make us not equal opportunity society members, but an equality of result. And they think they have the intelligence and they know they have the power to exempt themselves and force us to be radically equal. The second thing they've done is the Democratic Party used to, in the years of Harry Truman, JFK, they were the party of the lunch bucket, middle class, the union men. They despise the middle class. They have substitute for exploitation, class for race. They believe, and it started under Barack Obama, they created this idea of diversity. What did diversity mean? It didn't mean diversity of opinion. It didn't mean that people were intermarrying and integrating and that their race or their ethnic background was incidental, not essential to who they were. They didn't want that. They said, if you are not white, and they kind of adopted the rules of the old Confederacy, one drop, all of a sudden, in the last 30 years, you started seeing people you knew that were trilling their R's or saying that Elizabeth Warren said that she was Native American. Ward Churchill said that he was Native American. John King said he was black. It was this idea that suddenly this society that was based on the idea after 233 years we were evolving to an ecumenical society where race would be incidental. All of a sudden, the left said, no, that is exploitation. Because the middle class, the poor, and they developed a new vocabulary. Deplorables,
clingers, irredeemables. Biden added to it, fascists, semi-fascists, chumps, and dregs, and all of these people, regardless of their income or individual experiences, were culpable of exploiters. And therefore, the government would come in, not the government, but the people in the anointed classes within the government, and they would redirect things. And you can really see the perniciousness of it. When Michelle Obama, who's worth $100 million, every once in a while ventures out of her Martha's Vineyard estate or her Colorado mansion, I've been by it in Washington, D.C., it's something to see, or their new Hawaii mansion, and starts lecturing everybody in America how liberal and unfair they are. Or every once in a while, Oprah from her Montecito mansion has Meghan Markle from her Montecito mansion fly over to tell everybody how exploited she is by the royal family. And this is insane, but the left is doing this because they want to divide the country by race, by tribal affiliation, even though we know historically that every pre-modern society identified by tribe, and civilization, the work of civilization was to replace your tribal identity by a loyalty to a larger body politic that is irrelevant about race. Every society, whether it's the former Yugoslavia, or Iraq, or Rwanda, that reverted to a tribal society, we know where it ends. Every tribal group, when people feel that everybody's going tribal, they say, I don't want to go tribal, but for my own survival, it's kind of like nuclear proliferation. If they go nuclear, I'm going nuclear. I can see it happen. I live in a community that's 95% Mexican American, wonderful community. But given the temporal times, I will go in at 7 in the morning at Walmart, and I will see some white person. I have no idea who he is. He has no idea who I am. I walk by, he says, hi, how are you? How? Good to see you. And what he's trying to convey is, I'm going to be tribal and you look like me. So we're going to band together because everybody else is doing it. And you can see where this is leading to. And then the people who started this and created it and set it on fire, then turn around and say, you can't do what everybody else is doing. That is pre-civilization. And they're right about that, but they created this monstrosity called woke. And so this election is very important because, as I said, and I'll finish, is that people are onto this now. You're going to see an unusual amount of Mexican American voters reject this. I think you're going to see maybe not just 8% of African Americans, but maybe 12 or 15. And before you say, well, that's not very many, it's not very many unless you're the Democratic Party and you have deliberately tried to ostracize, insult, and turn off the lower white middle working class. And they vote now about 65% anti-democratic. And that was made up by the Diversity Coalition. They lose any little tessera in that mosaic and they're in big trouble. So what we will see in the next few weeks is anything other than the issues being discussed. We started with January 6th. No talk about the border, no talk about 40-year high and violent assaults, no talk about the highest energy prices in real cash that we've had in 50 years, no talk about Afghanistan, no talk about the collapse of the current foreign policy, no talk about, of course, at 1.1.2 and now it's 8.2, 8.1 inflation. None. It was January 6th, when that was exhausted, all of a sudden it was a historic raid on the Trump house. When that started to fade, it was he actually had nuclear secrets he was going to sell. When that failed, we went into the Phantom of the Opera speech and semi-fascist and all of you are existential threats to the republic. That faded with the Biden speech. Now we hear next week we're back to the January 6th. And then we'll probably see something about either a leak or an actual indictment of Donald Trump. That'll go all the way to the midterm because they are definitely afraid of all of it. And they're afraid of people that were in their parties that are onto it. So I think, just to finish, each person, according to our station, has a role to play. Some of it will be giving to candidates, some will be going to the polls. polls and watching the voting procedure. Some will be voting for the first time in 8 or 10 years. Some will be talking to friends. But you people scare me. I can tell you, I talk to these people every day at Sam. They are terrified. They're terrified of the American people. I talked this week to a very liberal person at where I work. I won't mention any details because it's going to be taped and the speakings might be heard. But he said something to me. He said, you know, we have a security patrol in our community. He lives in Apple. I said, yeah, that makes sense. And he said, you know, my daughter had a straight A average, and she didn't get into this university. I said, that makes sense. And then he said, you know, we're doing very, very well, but we had 13.3 income tax plus the basic income tax of 40. That was 53, and then the Obama period, we paid almost 60% income tax. I said, that makes sense. And what he was trying to do was tell me for the first time he couldn't continue to do that anymore. He felt that the people that he loved and trusted hated his guts. And I said, they hate you. They hate every aspect of it. Because you are successful, but you're not very, very well. They love very, very wealthy people. But they're in the attic and their foot is on the trapdoor and you're trying to get in and they don't want you up there. And they love the poor because the poor is distant and they can romanticize. And they hate the middle class because it lacks the taste of the very wealthy and the romance of the poor. And you can really see it with Martha's Vineyard. That was the most brilliant political attack I've seen in my life. Somehow, Governor DeSantis looked at that media narrative and he said, you know, we've got to talk about the issues, but I can't break through it. And Trump would not break through it because he was under assault. So suddenly he dreamed up this idea with a few other governors of putting 50 illegal aliens into Martha's Vineyard, one of the wealthiest, most elite, and whitest zip codes. And they lasted 48 hours before they were deported. And people cared so much about them. They went on the internet, they had signs, they gave hugs, and when that bus left, they were so happy. And what DeSantis was telling us was, these people who control our lives and open the border, they don't like the people coming across the border. You people are working people. You like immigrants. As long as it's legal, meritocratic, you want more people that are hardworking. The wealthy have created this sense of projection. They live in apartheid existence. They're privileged and they feel so bad about it that they want to virtue signal and performance art. So they just, what we learned from the 50s, you know, I went on a Fox News and I was asked about it. I said, we have 50 people living on 3 different enclaves on our avenue, the illegal aliens. They're in Winnebagos, they're in trailers, they're in sheds, they're in farms, 50 per farmhouse. And I never called the federal government. I never said, you know what, we're just swamped. They have 200,000 extra rooms and private mansions and hotels and offices in Martha's Vineyard. So what that shows us is when you can change the narrative and you can bring it back to a really important issue that the left has deliberately tried to destroy us, and they're hypocritical, and the reason they did it wasn't for what they said, it was the boarding. Why did they let people in? Because they want to change the demography, they don't like the middle class, they think they'll get permanent constituencies that will vote for them, and then when they're faced with the realities of what that means, they're shocked, they feel guilty, they're angry. Why did the right make us look so stupid? This was immoral. And that should tell us who they are and what strategy works best to expose them. So I would just advise everybody, vote, you're not crazy, and we're going to win. Thank you very much.
Any questions? Scott?
Victor, voter ID is absolutely central to taking back our country. Do you think in 2024, here in California, as a proposition, would voter ID pass here in California?
Well, the thing about voter ID is it polls overwhelming support, about 70% in every poll. And among African Americans, Latinos, Asians, it polls about 65, 70%. So there's nobody against voter ID except the liberal elite. And they're afraid that if you have voter ID, then people cannot be registered to vote who shouldn't be registered to vote. That's the. And so what they're trying to do, when we dodge the bullet, because the Constitution said that the state shall set quality laws, but from time to time the federal government can come in, an 18-year-old vote, women suffer. But it doesn't say the federal government makes voting law. But here they have this national voting, and they almost won, and that would have nationalized every state and required no voting ID allowed in any state. That's what they want to do, and I think the courts will probably, the Supreme Court will uphold it. If the people of California say that they want to vote in ID, I think it will pass. I think the Ninth Circuit will overturn it, but eventually the Supreme Court will sustain it. I never understood it. I live in a community, southwest Fresno County, that according to whatever survey you read is one of, if not the poorest area in California. And I go to the market, I go to everywhere, and every time I see somebody write a check, they have an ID. Many of them don't speak English. This idea that certain people can't have an ID is so condescending. They do have IDs, and they're happy to pull it out. And I think that they're not opposed to having it. It's their elite that doesn't want it. Remember, the same theme of all these things we're talking about has one theme, and it's historical. The left, whether it's the French Revolution, or the Bolshevik Revolution, or the Maoists, they never have 51% of the people. It's unnatural. Hardcore socialism is not human. It's not human nature to work very hard and turn over something to somebody who doesn't, or to share things in the sense of it's not really sharing, it's taking from somebody. People don't vote for that. So the way that these revolutions are implemented throughout history is by coercion, propaganda, and thick, stirred up crisis or melodramas or psychodrama. It's important to remember that. Take away January 6th is a good example. There was a bunch of buffoons that crashed into the Capitol. That was deplorable, and they should have been prosecuted, many are. But there was about 800 that were charged with illegal parading for going into the Capitol, walking around and turning out. They were in solitary confinement. They waited for 8 months before charges were filed. And then we federalized Washington, put 30,000 troops, strung with barbed wire, in the greatest militarization since Jubal Larrabee tried to attack Washington in 1864. And we said this is a crisis, we almost got it. That was not an insurrection. I think they charged 10 people with insurrection. They're not going to do that. That won't hold. But that's what they try to do. Because they need that drama to otherwise delude people from the real issues, which they always lose. It's important.
Any other questions?
I want to ask about governance and maybe some advice from you for Dr. Jones, others who find themselves running on a school board, being elected or appointed on a regulatory agency, city council, or assembly. And it's a complaint that a lot of people have about our current congressional leadership on the conservative side as well. What are your suggestions for how people effectively lead from the minority?
Well, if you say how do you lead from the minority when you don't exercise political power, for example, the Congress, then you can't afford to have any factionalism. You have to be united. But oddly, the left is much more united than we are. If you look at our senators and representatives, There's the Never Trumpers, there's still some of them, and then there's the Mitch McConnell wing, and then there's the Trump base. And so they're not uniting on the common group. They need to understand what they're for, what the majority is for of the Republican Party. And then the people who object to that have to cede control because they're in the minority of the party. The second thing is that we have to understand how the left operates. The left feels that because they're morally superior and they have morally superior ends, that almost any means necessary are justified by it. So you can see it. If you think that you're going to talk to some sophisticated Stanford professor and you say, this was a 22-month investigation by Robert Mueller and it found nothing. This was using GPS. This was Christopher Steele. This was Igor Dashchenko. They were all FBI informants and they were on payroll at the same time. They don't care. Their attitude is, well, it really helped us because he didn't get a conservative agenda for 22 months. That's how they think. And they think that at the national, the state, and the local level. So I think you have to start with the idea that somebody who's, I'm not talking about a mainstream old-fashioned Democrat, I'm talking about somebody who is a hardcore utopian leftist, that you have to expect anything at any time from them. And you have to expect that the rules that you're going to play by, the Marcus and Queensberry rules, they don't play by. It's not advice to play by the rules, but it's advice not to be a Mitt Romney or a Mitch McConnell and say, oh my God, I didn't think they would do that, or we would never do that. Just remember that the Republican Party at the national level has lost 6 out of the last 7 popular votes at a time when they picked up 1,000 seats in governorships, congressional seats, and Senate seats. The last time a Republican candidate won 51% of the vote was George H.W. Bush. George W. was not elected, re-elected. And what was that campaign on? Whether you liked it or not, they brought this guy named Lee Atwater, you remember him? And the first thing we saw was the Boston Harbor commercial. That this so-called environmentalist in Boston, Mike Dukakis, had a polluted bay. The next thing we saw was Willie Horton and the revolving door. Oh my gosh, that was cool. The third thing we saw Dukakis in a tank and his helmet off. And when he started 17 points behind George H.W. Bush, and he won by 6 points. And after he won George H.W. Bush, I feel so ashamed that he won. I'll never do that again. We all are God. Bring people, and every Republican said, I would rather lose nobly than to win. Whether it was Mitt Romney or John McCain, any of them. And so I'm not advocating to be ugly, but I'm advocating that you go into the ring with people who don't play by the Marcus of Queensberry rules, and you do what you should expect to lose.
We have a question over here. Even though that's the wrong school, I'll let you ask a question.
I'm a dentist, and I like to talk with my patients that I'm an advocate for their health. That I'm looking to do the right thing for them, to keep them healthy. And we need advocates in a lot of ways. My dad just came to see me, 87 years old, and he needed an advocate for root canals that needed to be done, and a lot of other dentistry. I think as the American public is voting, we'd like to think that we're making a vote for an advocate who's looking out for our best interests, who's really going to do the right thing, talk about the issues that are important that I really want. I want my children to have a good education. I want my cities to be safe. I want to have lower gas prices and put things back in a better place. Who can we vote for that's going to advocate for us? It's kind of an open question.
Well, I think that gets back to the idea that people on the other side don't want to talk about that because they feel that crime is a social
construct. By that I mean the left, if you look at these Soros DAs that 11 people out, and their way of thinking, and when somebody goes into Walgreens in San Francisco and walks out with a whole cart of food or anything, cigarettes, they feel, well, that's not really a crime because, you know, they think, well, it's against the law to steal a candy bar because wealthy white people don't steal candy bars, so they make that law, but it doesn't apply to everything. Or they feel that the wealthy made laws to protect their interests, so if people break them, they're not. That's their idea of crime. And they look at the border and they feel that we're in the 21st century, and borders are archaic and ossified. We don't need it, and it's discriminatory. And then they feel that there's disequilibrium between Oaxaca and San Luis Obispo. It's because of colonialism or neo-imperialism. Or if they feel that, you know, people go to school and you say to them 88% of professors are left-wing and they're lazy, so they teach personal stories about themselves and get off topic and they don't talk about literature or history. They'll say, well, the corporations and the society and the church are all conservative, so all we have is the university, so we have to be biased. We have to be racist to stop racism. We have to be biased to stop bias. So all of the issues you're talking about, of course, we all want to bring them up, and that's all that counts. But when you have January 6th and you have the debate on, as I said, the president, you have Joe Biden with a straight face say that half the country are racist and semi-fascist, but he doesn't talk about May to August of 2020 when it was 120 days of straight rioting. So then we get angry and say, well, you got to talk about that and that and that. And then when we reply back to them about that, then we're not talking about what we're doing. And that's what they do. And so look at Mark Milley, he was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And we had Lloyd Austin right before Congress. They brought in, the Congress brought them in and they said, think of all the things that were happening. There was, Afghanistan was unraveled. Putin was massing troops on the border to invade Ukraine. China was talking openly about taking Taiwan back. And they asked both of them what are the critical challenges of the Pentagon. And they said climate change and white rage. And we're going to go into the Pentagon and scour and find out what conspiracies. And I said to my wife, well, I hope there's data. I wonder who they are. And what did they do? They went after a rubric that if you look at the debt in Afghanistan and Iraq, and you use their formula, we don't think about race or class or gender, but they do. But if you use their methodology, you discover very quickly that white males were 33% of the population. And they died at 76% in Afghanistan, and 75% in Iraq. And you went after them and called them racist. And then 6 months later, you look at the Army's recruitment, and it's only 50%. It's down by half. They can't find people. And then you look at this latest poll by the Reagan Library. What's your confidence in the U.S. military? It used to be 45%. And they wonder why they can't recruit people from this rubric that historically goes in volunteers or grandparents from Vietnam. The son was in the first Gulf War, the grandson wants to enlist, and suddenly the parents say, I wouldn't enlist, you know. They don't know what they're doing in Afghanistan. Right after climate change, or you have a target of that, they're not joining. And that's what the left does. So it's very hard to talk about the issues when they're calling you all of these names, so you stop. And I don't want to go off topic, but it came to me about 15 years ago. I woke up one day and this Media Matters group was attacking me. A book that was 10 years old, it had been reviewed, it had been very well reviewed. So they hired this guy to write all these things. He said I was filthy, dirty, I was a nut, and so I had to reply. And so I wrote back, and I replied, and after it was all done, the editor wrote me a note. And he said, how did you like that? One thing you weren't doing is writing your right-wing columns while you were replying to all of our lives. You wrote it. And so that's what they do. And so it's very hard for a guy like Trump not to fall into that fallacy. So you've got to stick to the issues, and everybody has to say, we know what you're doing, we know what January 6th is, we know what the raid is, we know what the Phantom of the Opera, whatever that speech that Biden gave with a red glow and we know that, but we're not going to fall for it. We want to talk about gas, inflation, crime, the border, foreign policy.
Yes, sir. So, thank you, Dr. Hanson. Thank you, Dr. Jones. I'm running for Congress. There's a guy running for Congress in South County here named Dr. Allen. He came up with a contract to restore California. There's commitment to restore America, commitment to America. I'm wondering if you could help me know, and the audience know, what made Contract with America so successful, and how do we get that energy going right now?
The 99 most.
Yeah, compared to now.
Well, remember, in '94, nobody really knew what Newt Gingrich was, and Congress had been controlled for 40 years by the Democrats. And this weirdo that wasn't necessarily a charismatic guy came out of nowhere, and he said, "I will be Speaker of the House." And they said, "You're nuts." He said, "We will win 50 seats and we will take over the Congress, and the first 100 days we will do the following." And it was deregulate, cut taxes. We even talked about the Simpson-Mazzoli we reformulated the Simpson-Mazzoli Act. And what he was really saying is that we're going to force Bill Clinton to readjust. He didn't say they didn't take the Senate that year. They didn't have power, but they had one agenda. They were all agreed that they were going to introduce legislation and show the country what they could do if they had power. And that led to taking back the Senate and getting George W. Bush elected in 2000. But it was a sense of urgency. In the first 100 days, we were going to do this. Is what Kevin McCarthy is trying to do. He's trying to get all these different factions of the Republican Party to can we agree that you have to finish the wall and secure the border. Can you agree that you have to stop this crime rate, that if we take over, we'll either have to advocate that these local district attorneys will be removed by governors in Republican states. And they're doing that. DeSantis is trying to do that. In many state constitutions, they can remove a district attorney that deliberately does not enforce it. Not all. And then they're saying that we are going to deregulate and cut taxes to get the economy booming. We're going to open ANWR. We're going to build Keystone. We're going to lease. This administration has the fewest oil and gas leases in history of any other president. It's unprecedented. He created it by cutting back about 2 million barrels at a time of global shortage of this gas price. So they said that. And what they've got to be careful is, of course, that's what they're going to try to do, but they don't have the Senate and they don't have the presidency. So if they take the Senate, I think they will take the Senate, but they will not get 60 veto-proof seats. So what they can do is, I think they should tell us, we can stop dead all of Joe Biden's hardcore legislation. Yeah. We can force him to do what we did with Obama. After 2010, Obama was dead as far as new legislation. Last thing he did was Obamacare. So what did he do? He had to turn to executive orders. And that's a whole different ballgame, but it's a lot better situation than having them pass permanent legislation. So what Kevin McCarthy needs to say is, if you elect us, we're going to introduce these 10 things that we're going to try to introduce legislation. We may not get it through, but we will stop every Biden-led initiative. That's what it's going to do. We're going to win the Senate 60 votes to 14.